Hi guys, welcome back to T.N.T Garage and Performance, and in today's 101 video, I'm giving you guys the shaft. That's right, today we're going to be talking about the basics of camshafts and camshaft selection. Now, I'm not going to get in the nitty gritty of the green a cam or any of that stuff. We're going to get down to the garage man's build when you're looking for a cam and what you got, and a couple tips to help you along the way instead of just picking one out of a catalog just because this person says it works or that person doesn't say it works. So let's get into it. So, we're starting our 101 education today on camshafts. A camshaft is about the literal heart of an engine. The pistons can go up and down all they want, but if you don't have this little bump stick controlling when the valves open and close and the times that they do, well, it ain't going to do anything. So this is by far the most important part in your engine, and also one of the parts that if you replace it with a hotter part or a more performance-oriented part, it's going to be where some of your largest gains are made depending on your platform and your auxiliary components around it, like cylinder heads and your compression. But by far, a camshaft can make the biggest change in personality of your engine that would be otherwise stock. So, what are some things to look for when you're changing your camshaft? Well, the first thing you want to look for is how are you going to use it? So, use, what kind of power you want to make. And generally, you want to take into account the weight and gear ratio of your vehicle. So, weight ratio and how your engine is modified beyond stock. So, we'll put other modifications. So, say you've got a small block Chevy, small block Ford, small block Mopar that you have in just about anything, a two-wheel drive truck, a four-wheel drive truck, a car, something like that, and you want more power. And honestly, a lot of people that put a camshaft in their engine really want that rumpity-rump sound that an aggressive cam gives you, and we'll get into how you get that sound after we kind of nail down what you want to use it for. Do you want it for just the sound, or do you have the components on the engine to support the gains that can be made with that camshaft? So, what's your use going to be? You just want something that sounds really cool. You really don't care if it makes more power. You just want to listen to the cam chop. Then go ahead and start looking at specs of the cam. So, three key specs of camshafts are lift, then there's duration, and lobe separation angle. So, most of the time, if you're dealing with a close to stock engine, the way you get to that really choppy idle sound is a combination of a tight lobe separation angle and a little bit longer duration. And see what colors I have in my pocket here and see if I can illustrate for you lobe separation. So if you've got the lobes on a camshaft, which is a very, very poor drawing there. So here's the core of the camshaft. You got one lobe here, and you got your other lobe over here. The angle between the peaks of these two lobes is lobe separation angle. So that's your exhaust and intake coming along, what the separation between those two are on a given cylinder, and that's your lobe separation angle. The tighter you bring those two together, the more overlap you're going to have. The longer the exhaust and the intake valve are going to be open at the same time, and that's what starts giving you that rough idle. Duration is if we have a lobe and it's real pointy like that, duration is where the cam comes off the base circle. The base circle of the cam is where the valve's completely closed. Once it comes off the base circle and goes over and back to the base circle, that's your duration. That's how long that valve is moving, how long it's off the seat. You mostly get cams that are measured in total duration, which is just at the second that valve starts to move, whereas they're more commonly referred to as duration at 50 thousandths lifts. So once that valve or the cam is at 50 thousandths, it measures from there to there. So that's your actual true duration, is how long it's open from 50 thousandths back to 50 thousandths. So you have a pretty small duration here, whereas if you had a larger duration, you'd have a much thicker, beefier ramp coming into it. So lobe separation and more duration give you that cam chop. You can leave the lift, whatever it is, at 400, at 430, and you're still going to have a choppy cam because the valves are staying open longer and they're overlapping as they're staying open. So there's a couple just quick things if all you want to use that cam for is to get a ratty sound. Say if you're building something pretty lightweight that you already have a 350 in, that you don't necessarily need more than 300, 350 horse, but you want it to sound cool, you can go ahead and get a cam that will give you that tight lobe separation angle and a decent amount of duration. Now, when it comes to lobe separation angles, the most common ones are 107, 110, 112, and 114. The 107 is what comp uses for their thumper camshafts. That's why they sound so good, is they're on a real tight lobe separation angle, and it gives you that overlap. It gives you that kind of gallop, hot for teachers sound. They do add a bit of duration, so a stock cam would be in the neighborhood of maybe 190 to 200 degrees of duration at 50 lift. So that would be a stock cam. In most cases, in modern day camshafts, up to like our real higher horsepower into the Hemis, the LT stuff, things like that. So that'd be a stock kind of duration. And pretty much any time you're going to get into any kind of performance camshaft, you're going to have at least 215 degrees at 50 lift. So this would be like the very first cam in the catalog that you would get. It'd be something like the thumpers are about, they're 224-ish to like 230, and that they have a split duration pattern, which we might get into in this video, we might not, it's not really pertinent. But anyway, they have even more duration than that. So you couple that duration with that tighter lobe separation angle. So you got the lobe separation nice and tight, you bring it together and you have a lot of duration, which is, as the wider the egg, basically towards the top, you're going to have a lot of overlap, which is going to give it that really rough sound. Now, if you spread it out and go to like a 112 or a 114, say one cam that's pretty particular is an LT4 hot cam. I believe they run on a 114, but they still have a good chop to them because they have quite a bit of duration. So the fatter egg, even though you turn it apart, you're still having overlap because both lobes are wider. You're staying in that overlap longer with having them spread apart with that extra duration. So now that I've completely probably lost everyone and confused myself, we're going to get into just the lift. Because first we were talking about getting that rough sound. Lift really helps you gain performance because even though you might have all these where you want them, you might have like a 230 cam, which is 230 duration at 50 thousandths lift. You would have that on whatever lobe separation angle, and it would make power because of that overlap. Adds to scavenging, which we talked in our exhaust video last time. You add the scavenging, you kind of help make your engine more efficient. But lift is the big one. You can only pull so much air through a gap that's so wide. So most of your stock camshafts are like, particularly GM, say in Vortec days, they're around 400 to 430. So we'll just do 420 lift. It doesn't matter how long you're keeping the valve open, you're only going to pull so much air through that small of a gap. So most people go with a much bigger lift. You go 550 lift. And that's measured at the valve. You also, when you get a cam on a cam card, it'll give you the gross lift of the lobe itself, but they're usually listed for lift at the valve with factory rocker arms, which we'll get into after we get the base of this laid down. So, if you want a rump cam, but you don't have, say, the heads to support it, so lift is a big factor here. You can put as much duration and as much lobe separation angle in or take some away into any engine. Any engine, as long as the lift stays the same, it's not going to affect it. Now, where you need to start getting higher end parts is when you're going to higher lift. So that moves us into our power. You want to make power, you need more lift. You can make power on more lift without adding the added duration or the tighter or wider lobe separation angle. You can make power just on lift because you're letting more air in for the time the valve is open. The problem is with most engines is you can only get to a certain point of lift. You can get right in the middle with most engines before the real modern Gen 3 Hemis, the Gen 4 LSs, the LTs. You're about 500 lift, and that is it. That's all you can put in it because you are limited by your cylinder head. And that is how far you can open a valve before parts start crashing inside the cylinder head, or your coil spring binds, or you hit the guide or something like that. So when you're selecting a cam, if you want to make power, know your modifications. So if you have stock heads, you need to be mindful of that. Say, the best example, and everyone knows this, is the Vortec heads. The Chevy 350 Vortec, the L31 off of the 5.7 and the Chevys from 96 to 2000. They're great flowing heads, but they can only take about 470, 480 lift before parts start crashing together on top of the valve. So the keeper and all that stuff starts hitting the valve guide. You get spring bind. You get all of that. Unless you modify those heads, you can never put more lift in past that. Now, you could change some parts in the heads and use a different kind of keeper and retainer and all that to get a little more space, but you're still going to need to modify to get it there. So that's why I say all these go into selecting your camshaft. Now, let's just say you have the modifications to support the power you want to make for what you want to use it for. Then the world is your oyster. The AFR heads on the 350 that's going in this car can support 600 lift. So I could throw a 600 lift cam in that. Well, I can't technically because I don't have a stock rocker arm ratio. But again, we'll get into that. Now, before I forget, I'm going to throw this in here. One of the things when it comes to camshafts, when you're speccing them out, the lift listed with a camshaft is based on your factory rocker arm ratio. So if you have a Chevy small block, your factory rocker arm ratio is 1.5 to 1. Now what that means is it's the ratio from your trunnion or your pivot of your rocker arm to the push rod end, which would be your 1 out of your 2-1 ratio, and then from your trunnion to your valve tip, where the tip of the rocker rides the valve. That would be your other number of the ratio. So 1.5 to 1. That's what that means. And it's based off of whatever this measurement is from the trunnion to the push rod. If that's 3/4 of an inch, well then from here to here is going to be 1.5 that. So that would make it 1 inch. So there we go. That's rocker arm ratio explained. And if your cam is listed with a stock rocker arm ratio of 1.5 to 1 like mine is, its lift is 474. That's the cam spec on my cam that's in the 350 right now. That's based off the factory rocker arm ratio of 1.5 to 1. Now, I put 1/6s on that engine. It's got roller rockers on it, so it's got a 1.6 to 1 ratio. So it's going to make a longer lever to push the valve further. So what that means, at 1.6 to 1, my lift with this ratio goes from 474 to 507. Now, if you need to figure out, say if you have 1.5s, you want to figure out what it's going to be with a different rocker arm, you take your lift, say 474, you divide it by 1.5, and then that'll bring your number down to somewhere in the 3s. So 3 whatever. And you take your answer and then multiply it by your new ratio. So divide your lift with this ratio by this ratio, take the answer, the solution of that, and multiply it by your new rocker arm ratio, and that'll give you your new lift. So that's something to take into account when you have a cam that's pushing the thresholds of lift capability in your heads. Make sure that if you have different rocker arms on, that you're still in that window, because it will change your lift, and fairly substantially. So that's one thing that'll change, and duration can effectively change a little bit. Like on a cam like this, you might get 2 degrees, maybe 3 degrees extra duration, but what the rocker arm ratio, when you're going with a longer rocker arm on the valve side, you're basically getting a different lever and it's changing your lift. So you get more lift without necessarily having to get a cam that is a bigger or a smaller base circle to provide more lift. But I could put a big lift cam in that with all the duration I want, and it'll work. It won't affect the parts I have on it, and it'll function. However, coming back to modifications, it really depends on power that you're going to make for the modifications you have. So we talked about overlap when it comes to a camshaft. So if you want to use it, we're going to go back to that rumpity rump idle. You want that real rough idle and say, hey, I've got a set of heads that can handle it, and you get a high lift cam, so you get something out of the catalog that's like a Magnum Extreme Comp, whatever, and you get this big lift cam with a lot of duration, and the engine doesn't make any power. And you're wondering, well, it runs really like crap now and it doesn't make power. Well, that overlap in the equation of how long those valves are open bleeds off compression. So a lot of people have heard it that, oh, I've got too much static compression, I'm going to get a cam that'll bleed some of it off. So that's a dynamic compression. However, those cams are meant, those big nasty cams like that are meant for something with high compression, because you're going to have so much overlap that you're going to be bleeding off compression, and losing compression means losing power. So if you start with an engine that's 9 to 1, 8.5 to 1, 9.5 to 1, and you put in a cam that's got a shitload of overlap and is bleeding off compression, you're actually going to lose power with that camshaft. And that's why you need to go through all these when you decide what kind of cam you want to go with. What modifications do you have? If you're stock compression and stock heads, you are limited to playing more with duration and lobe separation angle than you are with lift, depending on the heads you have. If you have a low compression ratio, going back to modifications like an 8.5 or a 9 to 1, you are going to want to watch how much lobe separation angle you drop it down and how much duration you give it, because you might bleed off enough that you're losing compression and losing power. So that cam may sound great, but it's slower than stock because you're putting all your power right out the exhaust valve because it's open too long. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into cam selection, and I'm trying to keep it down for us garage guys of why it's so important to look through these lists without getting into the minutia of degreeing a cam. So we now know that what we want to use it for. So if you want sound, you just go with a tight lobe separation angle and a good amount of duration. If you want to make power, you need to look at your modifications. So again, low compression, pick something that'll fit in that range, that'll give you a little more lift, maybe max out your heads, and kind of keep the valves closed for as long as you can without hampering power. And you'll actually make power with a low compression engine. Now, you're completely confused with how all these specs work and how they work together, it's time to get into cam type, because there are different kinds of cams out there and you need to pay attention to it. So we will make some room here and we will start talking about roller cams, flat tappets, and solid versus hydraulic. So let me clean the board off here and we'll get back into it. All right, well, now we're going to get into cam material, cam style. So the reason why I have it set up like this is these aren't exclusive to each other. So there's basically two types that intermerge. You got a hydraulic style cam or a solid style cam, and that pertains to the lifter style. And then you have a flat cam or a roller cam, flat tappet or roller tappet, which again is about the type of lifter. So I have a couple of camshafts here. These are kind of beat up, but this one here is a hydraulic flat tappet camshaft. This come out of a big block Chevy, but it's pretty much the same across the board. This one is used, of course, because typically when you get a new flat tappet camshaft, whether it is hydraulic or solid, the lobes are covered in a DLC or a diamond-like coating that helps promote proper break-in and match from the lobe to the lifter. So I also have somewhere, probably fell on the ground, there it is, hold on a second. I also have a flat-tappet lifter, which is flat, and it's a tappet. So how these work is, as the cam turns, it rides on, the lifter rides on the lobe of the cam like that. Now, these have been in use for very, 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 very long. They have been around forever, and they are fine. I mean, a lot of hot rod factory-built cars like the DZ302 in the 67 through 69 Camaro had a very hot flat-tappet camshaft, and all it was just this flat-tappet riding on a lobe. And they work well. There are some inherent disadvantages of the flat-tappet, which we will get into after we talk about a roller cam. So here I have a roller cam out of a small block Chevy. They look incredibly similar, but the difference being between a roller and a flat-tappet is that the lifter that follows the lobe of the cam has a roller on the end. I don't have one on hand. I'll put a picture up probably right there so you can see the difference between that and a flat-tappet. And that roller rides along the cam lobe. What that does is a couple of things. It's less friction and less wear, and much, much less to go wrong as far as wearing a camshaft out. Now, these are not coated on the lobes when they're brand new. They just look like this, and typically you don't have to worry about a roller cam. Now, as far as what these cams are made out of that makes them different, all flat-tappet hydraulic lifter cams are pretty much made out of cast iron. They're cast as a core and they're ground into their final product. Most factory like roller cams like this is out of a Vortec 350. Most of these are an austempered iron, which is basically, they're just heat treated. The lobes are heat treated to be hardened, and that's why they hold up. Now, your aftermarket ones are also made of austempered iron like these, but when you get up into the real high-end cams or solid rollers, which we'll talk about solid and hydraulic in a second, they're made out of a billet core. It's a billet piece of steel that's then machined into a camshaft, and a lot of the newer ones have a pressed-on gear that's a different material. So let's talk about lifters quick, and then we'll dive back into a couple of nuances about these cams and what they're made out of. So when we are talking about a hydraulic cam, which all talks about the lifter, when we talk about hydraulic, we're talking about this little guy, and you can see that there's a cup in there with a clip, and what that is basically a plunger that has a spring underneath. So how is it hydraulic? Well, there's an oil port in it. So when oil pressure gets received by this lifter, it builds a cushion of pressurized oil inside, and that's what controls your push rod and goes up to your rocker arm and actuates your valve. So there's a little give every time it's forced up by the lobe of the camshaft, just a little cushion of oil that it rides on, and they're typically less violent to the rest of your valve train. A solid lifter is just a chunk, basically. Your push rod sits in it, there's no plunger, there's nothing. It is a solid, static piece of metal that just directly transfers energy from the cam to the rest of your valve train. Now, hydraulic cams are a lot easier to live with. You basically set the lash on them once, or preload in the case of a hydraulic lifter, and you never have to touch it again. The lifter does the rest. It takes up and absorbs everything. And as long as there's oil pressure and it doesn't collapse, you're not going to have an issue. Solid tappets are going to be something that you have to adjust the lash on, because if you get it too tight, you're going to hang a valve open all the time. If you get it too loose, you're going to be pounding the rest of your valve train, because there's going to be a gap in there that this shoves up, is not in contact with the push rod, slams into the push rod in turn slams into the rocker, which slams into the valve if you have too loose of a lash. So with a solid cam, you have to stay on top of your lash adjustments and make sure that everything is where it should be. Whereas a hydraulic, you really don't have to worry about it after you initially set everything up. Now, same thing goes for roller lifters. It's the same principle, just a difference in lifter style on the bottom. So let's talk about the advantages of all these. So a flat-tappet hydraulic cam, its biggest advantage is it is cheap. You can get into a performance flat-tappet hydraulic cam for most cases, even with inflation and everything, under 250 bucks. Hell, even throw the lifters in and you're at 350 bucks. And that's a cam, new lifters and everything. So they are incredibly cheap. The downside is, well, wear. The problem with a flat-tappet cam, especially in today's world of our lubricants and stuff like that, and a lot of knowledge that's falling away, is a flat-tappet, whether it's hydraulic or solid, really needs a lot more care. So what I'm talking about is, they're not built cheap. It's not like it's a shoddy product. The wear itself, and I can show you on this big block cam, is where your lifter is contacting the cam. When you first put one of these in, you have to make sure of a few things. One, it has to be basically drenched in moly lube. You want this thing to not have a second where it runs dry inside of a fresh engine if this is a fresh camshaft. The second thing is, you want to make sure that your flat-tappet lifters are free in their bores, because these have to rotate in the bore as the engine runs. So you make sure it's lubed, you make sure your lifters can rotate, you make sure everything moves freely, and then you cross your fingers and you start your engine for the first time. And the first startup with one of these with a flat-tappet cam is critical. You want, get a carburetor that's dialed in or have fuel injection that's dialed in. You want this engine to start the first time, and you want to get it immediately to about 2,000 RPM or higher. Get it up there and keep the valve train moving. You can fluctuate your RPM a little bit, but basically what you're doing is you are heat treating this camshaft. You are not only making the lobes a little harder, but you are also matching each individual lifter to its specific lobe. And the reason why that's important is these need to mesh together for proper operation, because if they do not start matching each other, or one wears quicker than the other, you're going to start taking lobes off your camshaft. Now, I'll show you the difference. Here's a lobe that's not completely trashed. Here's a lobe that's completely trashed. And this happens most commonly by either getting debris in the oil or an improper break-in. And it's a good way to not only wipe out the camshaft, but also take out every bearing in your engine if you don't catch it quick enough. And usually once you get one of these cams broken in the proper way and you run the proper lubricants, so don't run today's synthetic oil that you're going to put in your modern pickup. You need zinc in your oil to run a flat-tappet cam, because the zinc, it adds another layer of protection to these. It's what all old oil had in it back in the day when it was all just conventional oil. They had zinc in it, and that would ensure that these cams would survive in a stock engine, you know, because everything was flat-tappet back then for a long time. And you want to periodically, you know, if you're running one of these for a long time, go back and check your lifter preload, because if you start getting play in one of these, as far as not having everything set up, you're going to start beating the cam to death. So these are cheap. They're great for cheap performance if you don't have a big budget, but just know the risks associated with a flat-tappet cam. Now, what are the benefits of a roller cam? Well, they ain't cheap. I'll tell you that much. They cost many dollars. Many dollars. So they're expensive. However, pretty much carefree. So, when we're talking about a roller cam, the beauty of one of these is you can take it out of the box, slam it in the engine, put the lifters in, set your preload, and just run it. You don't have to break one of these in. There's no break-in period for a roller cam. They are just ready to go right out of the box. So that is the benefit of one of these. These are by far the most reliable, and you can actually get much more aggressive on all your specs. So the beauty of a roller cam is you can get a much steeper ramp from your base circle to max lift. You can really run it up, so you can go super long duration, and you're not going to affect the valve train as much as trying to ride a flat surface, which isn't technically flat on one of these, but a roller will climb it much better. So you're going to have a lot less stress on the valve train with a roller cam. However, they are expensive. Even in the basic like comp cams, like the Dash 8 series or stock cams where they're tempered iron, well, these are still $500. They used to be $400, but the economy sucks. So a roller cam, just the cam, is pushing over $500 from comp. You can get them for less from like Hughes and guys like that, or Howard's, but comps are particularly expensive right now, and it kind of hurts a pocketbook. Now, if you step up to a hot hydraulic setup, like a very aggressive, very racy cam, it's going to be a billet core, which is even more money. But if you're spending that kind of money on a camshaft, you spent that kind of money on the engine. Most of us garage guys, unless you're building something really radical, an tempered iron core like a Dash 8 comp cam roller is going to be all you need. You really don't have to spend the money on the billet core. Now, make sure that doesn't roll away. The benefits of a solid versus a hydraulic cam is, well, you do have better valve train control. If I could spell stability. So you get better valve train stability. And even though I just talked about all that where the lash has to be perfect, the reason why it's got better stability is because it's solid. There's no give in the lifter, and everything just kind of moves as one motion if you have it properly set up. You're not going to have a valve still moving while the lifter's still taking up the kind of slack inside of it. These are much better for high RPM and just hauling ass down a quarter mile. These things, they keep the valve train in check much better than a hydraulic cam would. So that, well, as far as the garage guy goes, this is all you need to know about a solid cam. If you're going to run it to very high RPMs, and we're talking, I mean, a lot of guys run hydraulic cams up to 65, 7,000 RPM. But if you're going to be doing that over and over and over in like a race application of, 7,000 and above, a solid cam is really the way to go, especially if you're making your power naturally aspirated, because you're got a big ass cam to make that power and you need that stability. Whereas say if you're running boost and you're running out the back door at 7,000 RPM, yes, you still do want valve train stability, but you're probably not running the massive cam and heavy springs and all that you're going to be running in an NA setup. So you can get away with making huge power run at 7,000 RPM on hydraulic if you don't have a very, very, very racy and aggressive cam. So now that we talked about those couple of things, we're going to talk about other things to think about with your cam selection. So give me a second here and we'll get into that. All right, other things to consider when you're getting a camshaft. And the first one is your distributor gear. Now all flat-tappet hydraulic cams are cast iron. So you just run a cast iron gear that comes on your whatever distributor. Now, a basic roller cam, so the tempered iron, the treated ones, have, the same basic, they're a treated iron gear. So, can you run a regular iron gear on one of these? Yes, you can in some cases and get away with it. However, for the cost, it is just much easier to go get a melanized iron gear to run on your distributor that'll mesh with this, because even though these are iron camshafts, they are treated, and there is a chance that if you run a basic iron gear like a flat tappet would run, you could tear up either the distributor gear or this gear or both, therefore destroying a very expensive camshaft. So running a melanized gear on an tempered core is highly recommended. Can you get away with an iron core or an iron distributor gear? Yes, you can. But just for the safety, spend the $50, get the right gear. Now, if you have a billet roller cam, you cannot run any kind of hard gear on it. You want to run a bronze or a poly gear, because it will not, even if they have an iron gear pressed on them, it's just a better idea to run a soft distributor gear. You will wear it out in time, and you will have to replace it. But a little bit of bronze or brass going through your engine isn't going to hurt it as much as the gear itself going through your engine. So those are some things to know about your distributor gear, especially if you are picking a roller cam. So know what your cam is made out of, and get a hold of the cam manufacturer. They'll tell you right out what you can and can't use on it. So just take those extra steps, be safe, especially with cams this expensive. So, the flat tappet, you can pretty much run anything on it. As far as a solid flat tappet, they're typically made of tool steel, so consult whichever cam manufacturer for what kind of gear to run your distributor on. However, if you have like a Hemi or an LS, you don't have to worry about it because there's no distributor gear, because it's the distributorless ignition. So that's the beauty of new engines, and you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. So now that you got all that figured out, you figure out what kind of cam you want to run and this and that, and you're getting the parts you need to go with it. There's one other kick in the butt when it comes to roller cams, which we'll get our example back out here, is that if you have an engine that is already roller, unless you want to change your lifters, your push rods, and stuff like that, you want to get an OE roller cam. So an OE style cam, because there are differences between an original roller cam and a retrofit roller cam. And the biggest one is that most OE rollers have their own retention. So as far as the cam being in the block, what keeps it from wanting to come out the front of the block is a retainer plate that sandwiches the cam into the block and the timing gear the other way. So OE rollers are set up to be retained into the block with factory hardware. A retrofit roller does not have this step and looks like a flat tappet on the end, where it's basically just like the backside of the cam. With those, you need to run a cam button because it will walk forward if you don't. Because rollers do not locate the cam, the lifters don't. Whereas on a flat tappet cam, the lobes are actually angled and the slightly dome shape of the lifters locate the cam, forcing it into the engine, whereas rollers don't. Your location is either at the front with a step at a factory retaining plate or a cam button that goes in the center of your timing gear that rides on the backside of your timing cover. So just be aware when you're choosing a cam, say if you have an 87 up GM V8 L69 aside, if you have an 87 up with center bolt valve covers, you have an OE roller. And if you don't want to go through all the work to do a cam button, change all the other stuff in your valve train, you want another OE roller. However, if you have a flat tappet engine, say an earlier 86 and earlier, all your old Mopars, your old pre-roller Fords, you need to get a retrofit kit, which is a roller cam with no step that requires a new set of lifters, usually a new set of push rods, and the cam button to ride on the back of your timing cover. So if you do not already have a roller motor, it is very expensive for most people to get into a roller cam. And that's why flat tappets are still popular, because it is very expensive to retrofit to a roller cam if your engine didn't already come with one. It was something I was going to mention before, but it does absolutely play a serious role in your camshaft selection. And that is talking about the base circle of your camshaft. Now what that is, if you look at one of these lobes and you turn it over and you measure the width of it before it gets into any kind of lift, that's your base circle. So the rolled bottom end of the lobe where there's nothing happening is measured as your base circle. Now that does change cam to cam. When it comes to OE rollers, they typically run on the same base circle as an OE roller aftermarket cam, but a lot of retrofit rollers run on a smaller base circle. So that means that this bottom part of the lobe where it goes around, where there's nothing happening, is physically smaller in diameter if you were to lop the lobe off and make it a complete circle. So be aware of the base circle of your camshaft because it will affect your push rod length. So if you think you're getting a cam you could just slap in and reuse your existing push rods, you want to make sure that it's on the same base circle, because that's one thing that'll really change your push rod length, other than a different set of lifters that have a different seat height, which that's something simple enough. Most of them are the same seat height if you're dealing with flat tappet to flat tappet or OE roller to OE roller. So be aware of your base circle. One reason they change is the core of the cam, or you can only get so much lift out of every lobe within the journal size of your cam. So in order sometimes to get more lift without having to go to a bigger cam bore in the block, if you make the base circle smaller, the relative lift from the circle, you can add much more lift. If, obviously if this is closer to the center of this casting, it effectively creates more lift without going past the diameter of your camshaft journals in the block. So be aware of base circle. Usually it's listed if it's on a stock base circle or not, but talk to your cam manufacturer if you're curious or don't know which one you have. So be very mindful of that because it could change a lot of stuff. As we just talked about the base circle of your cam, I have this big block cam here, And if we compare it to the small block, you can see at the top of the cams where the front journal is, this one's got an extra lobe, this one doesn't. This came out of a fuel injected OE motor. This came out of something with a carburetor, and that extra lobe is for your fuel pump, for running a mechanical fuel pump. And Chevy's, a push rod goes off, that activates the lever. So be mindful, if you want to run a mechanical fuel pump, make sure to get a cam with the fuel pump lobe. Now, if you have a fuel pump lobe and you're running an electric pump, it doesn't matter. But if you want to run mechanical, make sure your cam has a fuel pump lobe. So that's something to keep in mind when you're building an engine. Say if you want to build a 350, just get an 87 and up. The heads suck, but you can put Vortex on it or even put older heads on it that are good, like the double hump heads, and still have a good engine, but you're getting that roller cam capability. They're built for a roller cam, so you can just get an OE roller style aftermarket, and you can use your factory lifters, you can use your factory push rods. You don't have to worry about it, or at least factory length push rods if you're not running guide plates. So there's a lot less that goes into putting a big roller cam in something that already had one. The same thing goes with you Ford guys. The post roller small block Fords, Windsors, if you're going to want to build a 5 liter, something like that, go with a roller motor. You're going to get a better shot at more aggressive cams and not worry about the wear. Mopar, I think all Magnums, so 92 and up, small blocks are roller, so you don't have to worry about that either. So there's a pile of engines out there, specifically small blocks, that are already roller equipped. So you can use the stock valve train and just change the cam. Now, like big block stuff like that, you start getting up, it changes through the years. And of course, Gen 3 Hemis, all LSs, every LS up in the LTs, they're all roller motors. So you don't really have to worry about that. You can't put a flat-tappet in a Gen 3 Hemi or any LS that I know of, or anyone I know would be crazy enough to even want to develop that. They're all roller motors. That's just the way it is. So that kind of nails down as far as selecting a cam, what you need to look for, stuff like that. One last thing to consider. Remember how we were talking about lift, how much your heads can handle, and everything else. You also want to take into account how long that valve is staying open, because duration is measured in degrees of crankshaft rotation. You want to consider if that valve's hanging open when your piston's coming up the top dead center for too long and it's got too much lift, you can crash a valve into a piston. Now, if you have a otherwise stock engine with a stock rotating assembly with stock length rods and stock pistons, you're less apt to run into an issue, because sometimes the pistons are deeper in the cylinder at top dead center. This piston is out of a 74 big block Chevy. It's a flat top and it has 2 valve reliefs in it. So your chances of running a valve into your piston with too much lift or too much duration is going to be lessened. Most small blocks have a dish piston, so in the center is sunk down, and you're really not going to run into that issue unless you have a cam way too big for your setup. So that's something to check on a stock engine to make sure it's going to fit. But if you're running something like this, which is one of my SRP pistons for the 468, this has a dome on it. You can see it stepped up, and this is a baby dome. This is only plus 10 cc, but you can see it's got a massive valve relief in it to compensate for a high lift or high duration cam. So when you're selecting a cam, you want to measure, if you have aftermarket parts, where your top dead center is, where the piston's going to sit, and where your valve's going to end up. So a lot of people put clay on top of their piston, bolt their head on, put the cam in with light springs, run it over, and make sure it doesn't hit the piston. Most guys throwing a cam in a motor, like me, you guys watching, if you're picking an off-the-shelf cam, a lot of times the information is going to be there where it's going to say, hey, there is going to be valve to piston interference with this camshaft if you have this. So the nice thing is there's a lot of information that takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. Now, one engine in particular where it is critical on the amount of duration you have and the amount of lift you have is on a Gen 3 Hemi. Because of the nature of the Hemi heads, you've got a pretty tight window of how long you can keep them valves open, and the fact that they are like 10.5 to 1 compression. So the piston's up there in the bore, you want to be sure that you select a cam that doesn't crash your valves into a stock piston, because the Hemis have flat top pistons. And the other thing to remember on a Hemi or any newer engine like an LT or something like that, that has variable valve timing, that has a phaser that can turn the cam back and forth relative to its rotation, which would be advance and retard, you could crash it into the valves into the pistons from the cam phasing. So on engines that are variable valve time that you're putting a cam in, you want to put a phaser limiter in to keep that from happening. So those are the very basics of your camshaft selection. So I'm going to take a quick break, and we're just going to kind of bring all this into one happy circle, and hopefully this helps you guys out that, you know how to work on this stuff. I know you do. But, kind of some of the things, it's like, why is the what? So we're going to take a quick break and get into that. Okay, well, that brings us towards the end of the video, and we're just going to go over everything and kind of summarize it. So, one thing is, when you're looking for a cam, what do you want to use it for? What kind of power do you want to make? What modifications do you have? How heavy is it? And what is your gear ratio? All that goes into account. So that'll affect what type of lobe separation angle you want to have. So a tighter lobe sep, so closer to 107 or real racy like 104, 105, you're going to get that tighter lobe sep is going to give you more mid-range to high-range power. A looser lobe separation angle like a 112, 114 is going to get you more low-end torque. Now, same thing goes with your duration selection. A higher duration is going to get you out the back door at a higher RPM and make power before it noses over at the peak. Lower duration is going to kind of tend to, well, one, emission standards, and two, kind of help that low-end torque because you're keeping more pressure in the cylinder versus having more scavenging. And lift, of course, the more lift you have, the more air you let in. That's pretty simple, but it's one of those things. You have to have an engine equipped with all the right components to handle so much lift. So those are all things to take into consideration. Now, you can play around with these specs. Like, say, if you want something choppy, but say you still want a decent amount of torque, you can get a tight lobe separation angle and go a little less on the duration, still get that choppy sound, and still have a chance at lower end torque. Or you can invert it and have a looser lobe separation angle, which will help with that torque and give it a little more duration. It won't sound as aggressive, but it's hard to find a camshaft that really gives you the best of both worlds. And the way to get that is a lot of displacement, and then you can have a lot of duration stuff like that. Having the displacement gives you the torque. So that's basically how you want to select a cam. Then it's cam materials. Is it a hydraulic cam? Well, is it a flat-tappet and you want to save some money and you're confident that you can break that cam in properly? Or do you want a roller cam? And did your engine already have a roller? Can you save money by just buying a cam and using the rest of your valve train components? Or do you want to retrofit it, which requires all new components? Also, when you're putting an aftermarket cam in, you're going to have to change your valve springs to control that added action of your valves. So I didn't want to leave that out. Just saying. Remember, when you're doing this, you need to change your springs in most cases. Newer cams for Hemis and LSs, they have ones that are less aggressive that you can use your factory springs. But older springs, you want to replace them. So, most of us are going to be looking at hydraulic cams. A few of us that might want a solid cam, belt train stability. There you go. Now, one thing I did not mention throughout all of this is advancing or retarding the cam, which is degreeing a cam when you put it in. A lot of times you advance a cam, you make power there. And a lot of guys don't have a degree wheel nor the want to learn how to do it. So the nice thing is most aftermarket cams, unless otherwise specified, have an advance built into them. Like a lot of comp cams, mine in particular, has 4 degrees of advance built in. So you can install it straight up, which is just line your timing gears up, and it has 4 degrees of advance right off the bat. So you don't have to worry about degreeing a cam. They took the guesswork out for you. Where you want to degree a cam and either advance it or retard it is when you're really getting into something that you want to squeeze every bit of power out of that engine that you possibly can. And you can get gear sets to help you do that. So we're not going to talk about that in this video just because I want to keep it simple and get the information out there that most guys need. And this pertains to a single cam engine. It doesn't matter if it's single overhead cam because exhaust and intake lobes are on the same cam, or a cam and block single cam, like anything else is cam and block. But dual overhead cams are a different animal, which I'm not going to get into that because I don't play with dual overhead cams. I do know, just from common sense, that you have an exhaust cam, you have an intake cam, and you can actually change your lobe separation angle by degreeing each cam independently of the other. And that's why, like on mod motors that have variable valve timing, you can basically put a cam tune in it and make the phasers change your lobe separation angle and kind of phase as they're turning to increase your duration. And you can actually make something with stock cams sound like it has a chop by just playing with the phasing of it with VVT. So I don't play with dual overhead cams, but all of this stuff, as far as like these specs, all go into it. It's the same principle. Just know that you have one cam that's exhaust side, one cam that's intake side, and how to line them up, advance, all that crap. So that's where we are as far as camshafts. Now, we should probably listen to the difference between something with a stock cam and something with an aftermarket cam. So let's take a field trip outside because I haven't started that 350 in a while and I kind of want to keep everything fresh and moving in it. And we'll compare that to a modern, like very modern camshaft that does have some pretty good specs, but just isn't a racy cam that has a tight lobe separation angle or a lot of duration. So let's make that field trip. Guys, well, hopefully somewhere in my rambling in this video you guys learned just a little something more about camshafts, maybe if you didn't already know. So you got the basics down. What's your use? What are your modifications? What kind of power do you want to make? What's the weight of your vehicle? What do you want to do with it? Stuff like that. If you want a cam that you want to tow with, get a wider lobe separation angle, stay away from too much duration and get more lift. That'll give you that low end torque. If you want to run out the back door at high RPM, give it all the duration and have fun with it. If you want good mid to high range power without a lot of duration, go ahead and tighten that lobe separation angle up. And remember to make sure all of your parts in your engine can be compatible. So even though a camshaft can be the single biggest gain you make by changing it, you need to make sure it can be supported with the other parts in your engine, or pick a cam that'll work well with the parts in your engine. So there we go, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. It'll go in with the other 101s that are in the playlist, which I'll put up in the corner. And be on the lookout for the new video of the checker behind me, which in that video next week, we'll be throwing the fuel cell in, getting some power to the back, and getting that buttoned up to where we're getting close. Once we throw the engine in, everything is ready to go. So go ahead, like, share, subscribe, like I always say. Hit the bell icon so you know when new videos are coming out. And go ahead, follow me on social media. At Facebook at T.N.T. Garage and Performance, on Instagram at T.N.T. Garage and Performance, and on TikTok at T.N.T. Garage and Performance. And I have to say those all 3 times because, well, they're all spelled different or something's changed. So they're all at the bottom for you. And, well, until next time, remember, if it ain't broke, fix it till it is. We'll see you soon.